Om Jnanatimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Kamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jugatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gora Tishe Namaha Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, and then admit. Mrugank, do you reckon we could continue the notes from last week, like the same file, and then we'll open a new one for chapter 4, which will start soon?
Let me find it because I don't think I know I did say it, but let me find it and I'll share my screen again.
That's all right, because anyways, I'll be just running everyone past what we were discussing before. So last week, who can remember what we were doing? Who can tell me? I'm not sure who iPhone 8s is, but whatever your name is, I think they don't know that they're iPhone 8s. Okay, well, we've got it all up here, so I won't call on anyone then yet. So what were we discussing? We were discussing the second half of the chapter, and we just about concluded it. So Krishna, essentially, he's been arguing in this chapter to define what the yoga ladder is, right? Chapter 3, in very many ways, is a clarification of chapter 2. Chapter 2 gives the outline of the Bhagavad-Gita, and chapter 3 clarifies what is meant in chapter 2. We should really get a flow of the Bhagavad-Gita. Sometimes we have the habit of remembering the shlokas. Oh, here's this famous shloka, here's that famous shloka. We might know a thing or two from the purport, but we don't really feel what those shlokas are doing in context. But as we read, as we keep on going, we should be thinking, well, what's being done here? What's being done here? What's being achieved here, right? Why is this text being spoken? Why has this chapter been spoken? Because they're all spoken for good reason. And Srila Prabhupada, he gives those reasons in his purports. As to our previous acharyas, it's probably what they focus on the most. So I really think it's important to remember the flow of the Gita. Shankaracharya, he says, this Bhagavad-Gita is a river of nectar flowing from Krishna's mouth. So we should experience it as a river flowing, not as droplets or buckets not moving. So what happens is Krishna, now he's trying to not only articulate what the yoga ladder is, right? He's not only trying to articulate a response to Arjuna's misunderstanding, right? Arjuna's misunderstanding, thinking there to be separate paths. Because again, what is the principle? When we think of karma, what do we mean as jnana, right? Because jnana requires purification before being performed. Bhakti does not, right? So when we hear karma, karma always means jnana. In and of itself, karma does nothing, right? Well, I mean, it does do something, it purifies you, but it does nothing in terms of actually acquiring a goal. The goal of karma is to be qualified enough to be performing jnana yoga. Okay, so Krishna, he is clarifying this, right? There is only one path in regards to jnana and karma, but there are different levels of people on that path. And so Krishna, he's given two major arguments for this. One is he's saying, well, if you're not qualified for jnana, then you should do karma, right? Karma yoga, in order to become qualified to perform jnana yoga. But who should I call upon? Bhumi Gita Mataji, do you remember from last week what was Krishna's argument? Even if
Sorry, Prabhu, can you ask me the question again? What was the question?
What was Krishna's argument? He finished saying, if you're not qualified to perform jnana yoga, you should perform karma yoga in order to be purified for it, right? And so what was the argument he said following that? So he said, we have two arguments. This is in the structure of chapter 3, right? Firstly, he says, Arjuna, you're not yet qualified to perform jnana yoga. So therefore you should do karma yoga instead. And then he says, even if you were qualified for jnana yoga, you should still do karma yoga. And why is that?
It's a path to self-realization, or karma yoga is a path to jnana yoga?
Not exactly. I think Vidhi Mataji has a hand up.
Prabhu, I'll just attempt to answer this question. So Krishna gives two arguments to Arjuna, saying that first, if you're not qualified for Gyan, then do it for purification. And second, do it to set an example for others to follow.
Yes, so that's the thing. So the first argument is, well, if you're not qualified, then you should do karma yoga. But even if you are qualified, you should do karma yoga in order to set the right example, right? In order that we don't have sankarasya, right? In order that we don't have this unwanted progeny, and therefore we have societal collapse. So he's using the very argument that Arjuna used in order to renounce his responsibility, in order to say, well, you should do your responsibility, right? Okay, so I won't get into the details of how he established that, because that's what we did last week, right? So I'm just trying to joggle your memories. So after doing that, after that whole discussion, we hear Krishna gives himself as an example, then he gives, before that he gives Janak Maharaj, and then he discusses how the ignorant discusses with the wise, and then we get up to the section that we are discussing today, right? Which is the section concluding the 3rd chapter, and which very much ties into the 4th chapter. So in many ways, the breakdown doesn't work too poorly, where Arjuna says, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? Now he asks this because he's confused, right? He's confused. What is this thing which causes people again and again and again to return to these sinful actions that you're listing, right? Because it makes no sense. How can one be so foolish? And so Krishna then replies with lust. It is lust, O Arjuna, right, that impels one to do all of these things. And then we discussed the specific details, which I won't get into again, and Mrugank Prabhu has included in the notes. But then we read text 37, Kama Esha Krodha Esha. This is a famous text. I think it's one of your memory shlokas, isn't it? Is one of the ones you need to memorize, isn't it? 37? No? Oh, well, it should be. Memorize it in your spare time on top of your Bhakti-śāstrī shlokas. This is a very famous shlok, right? Kama Esha Krodha Esha. Okay, and then we hear the next text, and this is where we left off last week, and this is where I want to continue today. Dhumenna vriyate nir yathadarsho malena cha yathulbena vrito garbhas tathatenedam avritam. Maybe we will have Nitai Prabhu, would you like to read out the English? This is text 38.
Yet, as fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust.
Yes, very nice. So we find here, there is a description, right, of different levels of covering, right? So this lust covers in different levels of thickness. So we have 3 examples. What are the 3 examples? What are the 3 analogies being given? They're right there in the text, so people should be able to answer that quickly. Who can say, what are they? What are the 3 levels?
Well, like smoke, dust,
Yes.
And the womb.
Yeah. So we have fire covered by smoke,
Yeah.
mirror covered by dust, and embryo covered in, well, covered by the womb, right? So these are interesting. Firstly, they're all much more intense, right? When fire is covered by smoke, we all still see the fire, right? We can still see the fire. When dust covers a mirror, we can't really see the mirror anymore, but it's only a thin layer, right? If the dust is weak enough, we might still see the mirror, right? And even if it's not, with just one brush of the hand, it removes away. But the embryo covered by the womb, right? Well, we can't, these days with ultrasound technology and all, we can, but for a long while, we would have no idea, right, about the child in the womb. So this is the thickest, right? So there's an increase in thickness. And Srila Prabhupada in his purport, he actually compares the different types, what these all correlate to. So fire covered by smoke, this compares to humans. With the mirror covered by dust, who can guess what this refers to? If you look in the purport, you'll be able to see. Oh, Mrugank has already beaten us to it. That's all right. So the mirror covered by dust refers to animals, and 3, the embryo covered by the womb refers to plants, right? So the difficulty of clearing away that lust, right, is compared to the relative analogy. So for humans, right, humans have a very fortunate birth, don't we, right? For us, there is a lot of freedom in order to break away from the cycle of lust, birth, and death. For animals, it is maybe a little more difficult. It's possible, right? We know Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? He would dance with animals, right? The dogs would start chanting because of his mercy. So it's there. But it is a little more difficult, right? Gajendra is also a great example. And then lastly, the embryo covered by the womb, right? With plants, maybe we can think of the Arjuna trees, right? But in general is a little bit rare. So for them to overcome anything is very difficult. And that's actually why we find Arjuna trees being liberated by Krishna. The whole point of the story is that by the mercy of the Supreme Lord, anyone can overcome any level of conditioning or ignorance, right? So we find this is being elaborated here. Now, I want to make a quick note of something else that's mentioned, because I do think it's relevant and important to know, or rather it illustrates this. This isn't necessary to know. It's not from Bhagavad-Gita. It's from, it's from the writings of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. It's from Jaiva Dharma. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he goes into a little more detail, and he compares these levels of covering to a plant, right? A plant that is growing. So if we had a plant, at the root, we have the level called achadita, or it's called avrita. Who can tell me, what does avrita mean? You'll be able to find in the synonyms.
Covered?
Covered, yes. So Mrugank, if you want to write these, draw out these different levels underneath this one.
Am I drawing
So,
a plant?
yeah, if you can draw a plant, that would be nice. So at the bottom, we will find it is achadita, right? Achadita means also to be covered. That's the word that Bhaktivinoda Thakur uses, but I've seen other acharyas call this avrita. And this means covered, right? And so this would refer to like, this would refer to even animals or trees or stuff like that. I mean, would refer to like trees and stones and stuff like that. Then the next level, just so the spelling is proper, it's ACC, and it's a long A for the first two A's. So achadita. Okay, and then as the flower grows a little bit, right, it's stunted, right? And so this would be the various like animal lives, right? And this is called Sankuchita, which is SANKUCITA. And there's all dot on top of the N because it is the velar nasal, right? And so this is the budding plant, right? This is the plant when it's budding, when it's stunted, sorry, when it's stunted. So this is the stunted growth of the plant, right? The plant is trying to grow, but it's not really going very far. Then at one point, the plant, it starts growing, right? And it starts budding properly. And this is the human consciousness. So this is a development of consciousness. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he compares the growth of consciousness to a plant. And so when it starts budding, then Bhaktivinoda Thakur has said, this is human life. And he calls this mukullita.
Is budding different to fully flowered?
Budding is very different to blossoming, yeah. So budding is when it's, we've all seen a budding flower, right? It's when it's still like very green and all the leaves are compacted up, yeah. Yeah. So this is mukullita, and this is the human birth, right? So consciousness has developed even more. It's now flowering even more, right? But then now, and this is mukullita, mukullita. And then now we come to the final two, right? We have vikasita, right? Which is blossoming. And this is when the flower begins to blossom. And this is, well, this is all of us, right? Or at least, at the very least, this is all of us, right? These are people who have begun sadhana. They've begun their spiritual lives. And so the flower now is finally starting to blossom. The flower of their consciousness has moved past lust. It's moved past all the coverings, and it's beginning to blossom. And this is vikasita. And then finally, the flower fully blossoms. And this is purna vikasita, right? So it is complete vikasita. This purna vikasita, this is the great, great devotees who have perfected the spiritual path. So their consciousness is like the fully blossomed flower. They fully experience what consciousness is. They fully experience reality. And so the fully blossomed flower, this is the great devotee. So this is how Bhaktivinoda Thakur has described the same phenomenon in greater depth. So we can see this is a common thing, right? Because the level of change in consciousness that happens between a plant and a human, which is very, very high, also happens. That same level of difference is there between the regular human being and the great devotee, right? Because the great devotees are human beings fully alive. They are able to perceive reality as it is. untainted by all questions of lust and other concerns. Okay, with that, let us keep on going. So then we hear in text 39, avritam jnanamete na jnanino nityavairina kamarupena kaunteya dushpurena nalena cha. Maybe we can have Mrunal Mataji, would you like to read out the English?
Yeah, Hare Krishna. Thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his external enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Hare Krishna.
So we see here, thank you very much. We see here again, what is Krishna saying, right? He's just continuing on this point. Lust, not only does it cover one, but it is never satisfied. It is a covering that never goes away unless it is satisfied. Pururava in Srimad Bhagavatam in the 11th canto, he describes lust and he gives a wonderful description, right? In the same way that whenever we pour oil onto fire, is the fire ever extinguished? The oil looks like water, doesn't it? But it never extinguishes the fire. Instead, what happens? What happens when we pour oil into fire? What happens? Divyansh Prabhu, what happens when I pour oil into fire?
It grows.
It grows, exactly. So the opposite of what we might want happens. So the more you try to feed lust, in fact, the stronger it gets, not the weaker it gets. So this is never satisfied and it burns like fire. And just like fire, we want to pour water on it, but all we have is oil. And all we do is we feed it and let it grow stronger and stronger. And then text 40. Indriyani mano buddhir asyadishtana muchyate etar vimohayatyesha jnanam avritya dehinam. Maybe Sri Mataji, would you like to read out the English?
Hare Krishna, sure. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders.
Jai. So this text right here, right? So now what we find in text 40, Krishna, he has transitioned, okay? And now he's talking about directly addressing this enemy of lust. And what he does is he describes what is often called the kingdom of lust, okay? This is the kingdom of illusion, okay? So text 40 describes it. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence, they are the sitting places of this lust, okay? So these together, they form the society, they form the civilization of lust in our own bodies, right? The kingdom has been described. Now, these three locations, right? These are where lust is positioned. The analogy that's sometimes used is these are the places which have been occupied by the enemy forces, right? The enemy forces have occupied our body, right? And so they've occupied it in the three spots of our senses, our mind, and our intelligence. But now in any conflict, in any battle, we need to think, right? If we are fighting against our lust, and we are trying to fight against our lust, very famously, the Apostle Paul, he writes, what I want to do, I do not do. And what I do not want to do, I do, right? Which I find is a very, that's very much all of our condition, or at least many of our conditions, right? We can all relate to that, right? What we do want to do, it doesn't happen because we get bewildered by lust. And what we don't want to do, well, much the same, we do it because again, we are bewildered by lust. So anyways, we have these three enemies and we should think strategically how to conquer them. Who can say, maybe we can have a vote. You can raise your hand for each place, whichever place you think should be conquered first. Okay, who thinks first we should conquer the intelligence? Please, a raise of hands. Okay, who thinks we should conquer the mind? Okay. Okay, the mind's definitely more popular than the intelligence. And who thinks we should conquer the senses? Oh, I think the mind won by a few votes. Well, let's read the next shlok and let's find out, because Krishna says exactly which one. Tasmatvam indriyan yadav niyamya bharatarshava papmanam prajahiyenam jnana vijnana nashanam. Maybe let's have Alex, would you like to read out the English?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Paratas, in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin by regulating the senses and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization.
So there we go. Thank you. Everyone who voted the mind, it makes a lot of sense to conquer the mind first. So that's why I asked everyone. There's good arguments for each one of those points, actually. I was surprised nobody was backing up intelligence. Because you can argue that intelligence is the root of all of the other three. And then the mind, obviously, the mind is what drives the senses. So if we conquer the mind, we don't need to bother about the senses. But Krishna, he takes the view that we should first conquer the senses. And now there's a few different ways to think about it. Firstly, we can say that the senses, what are they? They are on the fringes, they're on the outskirts, right? When you go in a battle, you don't go straight to kill the king, right? In the old battles, you go and you take down the armed walls first, right? And so the senses are the armed walls of lust's occupation of the body, right? So this is one way to think of it, right? Lust is the first point of access. But the other way to think of it as well is that, well, how does this work with lust, right? Our senses, they see the thing we are lusting towards. And then our mind, it picks up on the senses, right? And then the intelligence, bewildered by lust, chooses to do them. If you get rid of the senses giving all of this negative input, then the mind and intelligence don't have much to work with. You suffocate them almost. Now we will quickly come back to this because we are not speaking about repression. Too many people use the Bhagavad-Gītā to justify repression, which is not at all what is being discussed here when we speak about conquering the senses. But we'll come back to that in a second.
Can you give me a sec, please, to write that down?
Okay, then I will talk about repression. So what does Srila Prabhupada say? In the final paragraph of the purport, he says, lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principle of devotional service. So from any stage of life, or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. So first, very nectar purport, but what point is Srila Prabhupada making? He's not saying sit down and every time your senses flare up, just, shove them down into the pressure cooker of, Freudian repression, right? He's not saying this. He's not saying to take all of your, because the senses are impossible to conquer like this. And I think we've already discussed all of this a lot, right? The second chapter is built upon this. The third chapter is built upon this as well. And Krishna, he is saying conquer the senses, but Prabhupada is making clear the senses are not conquered by ignoring the senses. The senses are conquered when they are directed towards a higher taste. And what is that higher taste? It is Krishna, right? How beautiful is Krishna? How captivating is Krishna, right? by the beauty of Krishna, by the beauty of service to Krishna. This is the way the senses are conquered, because they are used fully. So strongly the senses can be used in Krishna's service. When Krishna left Vrindavan, does anyone know who was sent to represent Krishna when Krishna was in Vrindavan, to send a message? Somebody came with a message from Krishna.
Uddhav?
Uddhav, yes. So Uddhava, he went to Vrindavan and he went with a message. And when he found all of the devotees, he found all of them, they were in complete torture because they were separated from Krishna. Why? Because no matter any way they used their senses, all they could do was remember Krishna, right? Wherever they would go, if their eyes were open, they would see all of the trees, all of the rivers, all of the fields, all of the cows, everything that Krishna used to play with so sweetly. And they would become so distraught in pain. And Mother Jashoda had said, she would open her eyes and she would think, where is my dear Krishna gone? And when she would close her eyes, what would happen? What happens when you close your eyes? It's dark, right? And so when she closes her eyes, all she would see is darkness, and she would remember the beautiful dark skin of Krishna. And so she would say, if my eyes are open or if my eyes are closed, all I can think about is Krishna, right? And I miss him so much. Of course, when we study Nectar of Devotion, we'll study this sort of stuff much more. And we'll dive into how this is actually some of the highest forms of spiritual ecstasy, to feel separation from the Supreme Personality. But anyways, like this, Mother Jashoda, she would lament, right? Her senses are fully absorbed because she has full love of Krishna. No matter how she uses her senses, even closing her eyes, she can't stop thinking about Krishna. What then to speak about anything else, right? What then to speak about thinking about getting a burger or something, you know? We find that distasteful even to hear, right? That Srila Prabhupada or Mother Jashoda or any of these great personalities would even think something that terrible, right? Because, why? Not because they've sat down and conquered their senses through just hating the world, but because they've come to love the world truly, which is loving it in Krishna consciousness. So again, I hope I've made the point clear. This is not repression, right? This is the opposite. This is, in fact, the complete repression is denying your senses, denying your needs. Krishna consciousness is fulfilling them in the way that nothing else can. The beauty of Krishna consciousness fulfills all of the sensual desires, right? Everything is there in Krishna consciousness. Everyone wants to sing, everyone wants to dance, everyone wants to eat nice food, and everyone wants to think, everyone wants to read, everyone wants to hear nice stories, and all of those things and so much more, right, are fulfilled in Krishna consciousness. So it's not repression. It is the opposite. It is identifying those fundamental needs of the human person and fulfilling them with the infinitude, right? Krishna is the water which does feed the lust and which does conquer it. Our attempts to satisfy the senses by doing all sorts of material sinful things, right? And as we remember, everything that's not done in the service of Krishna is sinful in a sense, right? Our attempts to do that, they are oil on the fire and they just ignite it. But the beauty of Krishna, that is something which does conquer lust and which comes, again, what does Prabhupada say? Lust is only the perverted form of love of Godhead. And when that lust is conquered, what happens? Then genuine love of Godhead arises. Okay, we'll wrap up now soon, chapter 3, because I only wanted to spend a few minutes on it, but too nectarian. Okay, so then what happens? We hear text 42. Indriyani paranyahur indriyebhya param manaha manasastu parabuddhir yo buddhe paratastu saha. And then I will just read the translation so we can finish chapter 3 quickly. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. So Mrugank Prabhu, if you want to draw out this hierarchy with the soul at the top, then intelligence, then the mind, and then the senses. We should remember this. This is a very key part, sometimes on book distribution. they'll say, right? Especially if you talk to younger people, people are very much into psychology, right? And I don't think it's very wrong to say there's lots of academic work been done that the Bhagavad-Gita is one of the early texts of psychology, right? It's one of the early psychological texts because it's talking about the different psychological factors. It's talking about questions of repression, the mind, feelings, how our psyche works, right? So this is, if you will, the basic model of Bhagavad-Gita psychology, right? And it's very important because that is a central concern of the Bhagavad-Gita. Prabhupada writes this in his Bhagavatam commentary. He says, Bhagavad-Gita is on the platform of the mind and intelligence. So we find this hierarchy here, and we'll talk about this hierarchy more as we get into the further chapters. So what happens is, normally, this is how the world should be, right? Normally, it should be going down, right? The soul wants something and the intelligence does what the soul wants, and therefore the mind serves the intelligence, and then the senses serves the mind. We all know the difference between the intelligence and the mind, right? The mind is that which produces thoughts and ideas, which says I like and I dislike, right? And intelligence is the thing which actually, it's like the boss, right? So in our mind, let's use the example of a math test, right? When you have a math test, your mind is the thing which says, when you open up a question, right? Your mind is the thing which says, oh, yuck, this is a hard question. And your intelligence is the thing which directs the mind to solve the question, right? So the intelligence solves the question and the mind is the thing which says, this is, I don't like this question, right? But the problem is the way things are happening now, how is it? The senses see something, right? And then the mind says, okay, yeah, whatever the senses say, I'll do. And then the intelligence says, oh, well, the mind's given me this idea. The moment we say, I like, I don't like, the intelligence doesn't determine anything. The intelligence just follows the mind, right? And then the soul is there completely covered going along. Does this make sense? So ideally, the relationship should be going down, right? The inferior serving the superior, right? Please don't take that sentence out of context because it sounds terrible outside of context, right? But the inferior aspect should be serving the superior aspect in the psyche. But today, most people, it's the other way around, right? The superior is serving the inferior. Yes, completely, right? As Alex has said, that's what they tell you, right? Do what you want, what you want to do is who you are, right? And it's a shame because they're onto something, right? They're onto the message of the Bhagavad-Gita, be who you are, right? Don't be someone you're not. But they miss it because they identify all of who you are with what your senses tell you you are, right? So again, they're onto a good thing, but they just need the message of the Bhagavad-Gita. Okay, there's a huge and wonderful purport, but again, I do want to wrap up chapter 3. There's an interesting point, and I'll only mention this quickly. No need to put in the notes, Mrugank. Srila Prabhupada, he puts soul in brackets, right? Did we all notice that? If you check your text, the reason why is saha is actually, it's unclear exactly what it refers to. It could refer to 3 things. It could determined by the context. It could be referring to lust, in which case, lust being superior to all of them, would just be Krishna emphasizing how powerful lust is, right? Lust rules over all of these. However, I think lust is a very unlikely reading based on the next text. The other readings is maybe that it's a Supreme Personality of Godhead, which would line up with what Krishna has said, right? The beauty of the Supreme Personality, or rather what Prabhupada has said, the beauty of the Supreme Personality is such that he conquers all of these other things. But I think most likely is what Srila Prabhupada has given, that it is the soul, because what do we hear in the next text? Evam buddhe param buddhva samstabhyatmanam atmana jahi shatrum mahabaho kama rupam durasadam. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjuna, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus, by spiritual strength, conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Okay, so I think this text makes it rather clear that the saha, so saha in Sanskrit just means he, right? It's a third person pronoun. But I think it makes it very clear that pronoun was referring to the self, the Atman, right? The soul. Because what do we hear here? Thus knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, so on and so forth. So I think that is the much more likely reading. And with that, we conclude the third chapter. Now, the third chapter, it concludes on a point. So before we go off onto our break, I'm going to say how this relates, how this now will relate to the fourth chapter. Because we're hearing something towards the end. Of course, Prabhupada here said in the purports that it is through Krishna consciousness that we conquer lust. But there's a certain other thing which Krishna keeps bringing up in the Sanskrit to refer to how lust is defeated. Can anyone tell me?
Jnana, knowledge.
Yes. Jnana, knowledge. What do we hear? Lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity. So the fight is between lust and knowledge, right? But therefore, O Arjuna, right? In the very beginning, this is text 41, curb this great symbol of lust by regulating the senses and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization, right? So we're hearing all of these things, right? This thing, it conquers knowledge, it kills knowledge. But then at the very end, Krishna says in text 43, right? One should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence. So even though lust fights intelligence, even though lust fights knowledge, ultimately it is knowledge which conquers lust. And so therefore, Arjuna, now hearing about this knowledge, he asks a question. And what is that question? That question is, well, what is this knowledge? How do I get this knowledge? And the answer to that is how we begin chapter 4, right? So chapter 4, therefore, is called Transcendental Knowledge. And we'll do a little overview. We'll have our break now because I think this is a natural point to have a break. But we'll cover the meanings and the overview of chapter 4, as well as I'll take any questions on chapter 3 as we move away from chapter 3. If anyone had any questions whatsoever, I'm happy to quote those questions now. Otherwise, we will have our 10-minute break. 5-minute break, wait, 10 minutes. Now I've forgotten how long I normally make the break. We'll make it a 5-minute break today. Okay, if there's no other questions, then I'll see you all in, I'll make it a 10-minute break. I'll see you all at 11, okay?
I have a question.
Yes, for sure, please.
I've heard arguments like, sometimes people like Richard Dawkins and all, they say, like your spiritual experience is in your mind and therefore it's delusion, like you've just imagined it. But then I've also heard counter arguments where people are saying, well, if the soul is beyond the intelligence and beyond the mind, then the spiritual experience being on that level of the soul is sort of understandable by the intelligence and by the mind, and therefore you can't say using your intelligence whether it's delusion or not, because it's beyond the intelligence to intellect. And I would say, how do we differentiate between what experiences has been on the level of the soul and what experience has been on the level?
Okay, so firstly, regarding Dawkins' argument, it's always so silly because Dawkins is, there are some intelligent atheist philosophers, and Dawkins is not one of them. Well, he's not a philosopher, right? He's a biologist. So he's good at biology, but he's a nightmare at philosophy. It's always silly, right? They'll say, oh, well, it's just all in your mind. Well, so is everything else. What else do we have but our mind to experience the world in? Everything that we experience is through our mind, right? They're not cutting through their mind and experiencing the world directly. They're experiencing it through their mind just the same as the rest of us, right? What is science but trying to find the patterns and the observations we have in our mind, right? So they're not doing any, they're no better, right? They're on no greater an authority than we are, right? So when they say that, it's always a silly argument to begin with. How do we distinguish between the two? Well, that's the beauty of studying Bhakti-śāstrī, right? So that's the whole idea. We especially when we get to Nectar of Devotion, we'll study all of that a whole lot more. That's why Nectar of Devotion is so important to study. It's really that practical manual of identifying what is an experience, a spiritual experience, and what is a mental experience. Sometimes it can be hard for us to distinguish, right? I think it's much more tangibly physical. Yeah, but what is tangibly physical, right? Anything, or what is a tangibly physical experience but an experience in the mind, right? It's this weird idea that we've got that that magically our senses don't exist in our mind, but they do, right? Well, all of our senses are going through our mind. So a tangibly physical experience is just as much a product of the mind as well, you know, what would be called a non-tangibly physical experience. Right?
But wouldn't you say that, let's say, you know, I take a cylinder, it's, you know, got no air in it, and I put a feather and a rock in it, they both fall at the same rate. Even though you can say anything that's tangibly physical is still going through our mind, we only experience it through our mind. I feel like many people can validate the fact that the same thing happened, but no, you can't. But with a spiritual experience, only you can validate it, and therefore it's easy to fall victim to it.
Oh, I get what you're saying. So because in a general level, because often people say this as well, as if like the whole human race hasn't been validating like spiritual experiences. You know what I mean? Like there is a spiritual experience that's happening, and right, like people will say, oh well, I can verify it. But I think with any scientific experiment, and I think if we look at history, the one thing that's been verified the most is that there are spiritual experiences, right? So I think at least for the validity of spiritual experiences, we have, like, again, literally every culture on earth has developed some sort of mysticism, some sort of spiritual practice, right? So there's that. But in terms for our own personal needs, this is why it's important just to have spiritual guidance, right? You want somebody who's it's the same with any science, right? You want somebody who's very used to these experiences. You want somebody who's very used to maneuvering this world to guide you personally. It's a case-by-case basis thing, which is why, as we will discuss when we begin chapter 4, which is why it's so important to have a personal spiritual guidance, right? You can't read in a book in order to determine these things. These are things which need to be taught on a person-by-person basis, right? In order to understand one's personal experience of it. So yeah, in terms of an argument, it's poor, right? Because an argument against the existence of God is pretty poor because far from nobody else having that experience, everyone has these experiences, right? These spiritual experiences all over the earth, right? People are experiencing this in different ways, but they're still experiencing that same underlying thing. But in terms of practical concerns, then yeah, it's a very good point. And that's why we need just personal spiritual guidance.
How would you differentiate, I guess? Sorry, first of all, I want to say thank you for the answer. I think it answers the question. Thank you. How would you differentiate between someone saying things like, you know, like the Loch Ness monster isn't real, apparently, but they feel like, oh, that's good.
Okay. I'm not sure if Mrugank will be back soon. I think we'll take the second half of the question after the break then. So we'll just do a quick I genuinely am mind blanking how long I normally make the breaks, but we'll do a quick 10-minute break. I'll see you all at 11:05. Okay, Hare Krishna. Okay, I reckon let's start a new file now for chapter 4. So, as we discussed, chapter 4 is called Transcendental Knowledge, right? Now, chapter 4 is most devotees, it's often said when studying the Bhagavad-Gītā that most devotees, they want to rush through the first 6 chapters, spend 6 years in the middle 6 chapters, and then rush through until chapter 18 for the for the remainder, right? Because we get, I'm sure most of us, as people who are associated with Krishna consciousness, we sort of want to hear about Krishna, you know what I mean? We don't want to hear about this duty to society, that duty to society. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's bad, but we want to hear about Krishna, right? And we won't really hear much about Krishna except indirectly until we get into those middle 6 chapters, right? However, chapter 4 is very nectarian because the first half of chapter 4 is pretty much the only time we'll really start hearing about Krishna, right? Chapter 4 is really situating us. Remember how I said before, we had a few drops of bhakti in chapter 2, then chapter 3 brought some buckets. Chapter 4 is straight up unironic bhakti. The word bhakti is mentioned for the first time. It's full of bhakti nectar. It is bhakti, bhakti, bhakti. From up to down, bottom to top, it's at least the first half. There's a lot of bhakti going on here, right? So even though it's not directly describing devotional service, it's the sort of stuff that we as devotees relish. So I'm very, very excited to get through chapter 4. If needed, we'll take some time out of chapter 5 to do chapter 4, just because I like chapter 4 a lot. So firstly, we'll do a little overview of the chapter. So if we go into the notes, so as we know, chapter 3 concluded on what? Who's Oppo A3? Just out of curiosity.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, this is Katyayani. I'm outside Prabhu. I couldn't connect through computer from home.
For sure,
So I have to,
just
sorry,
because
Prabhu.
I need to know the attendance, that's all. Like no worries at all. Connect however you need to, just for attendance sake.
It's Katyayani Prabhu.
Yeah. Okay, so chapter 3 concludes with, actually then, Mataji, what did chapter 3 conclude with, right? We're hearing about lust and how do we conquer lust?
So by conquering the senses.
Yes, conquering the senses with
the knowledge.
Knowledge,
The
yes.
Arjuna's question is, what is this knowledge?
Yes. Arjuna wants to know the transcendental knowledge by which we can be free from the bondage of lust. That's why this chapter is also sometimes called Jnana Yoga. That's the Sanskrit title. And so when we see the whole structure of this chapter, we'll see this chapter is structured entirely around, well, transcendental knowledge. Unlike chapter 3, which I find breaks really easily into sections, I find chapter 4 is more like this really nice flow. Like it's more just this one flowing sort of sentence almost, if that makes sense. So we will do a basic breakdown, but it's not as rigid as the 3rd chapter one is, where there are these very, very clear categories, at least in my opinion. But one interesting point is that what is transcendental knowledge? What is truth, right? The famous question that Pilate proposes, right? What is truth? Truth, we sometimes think of is a fact, right? Truth of facts, 1 + 1 = 2 is truth, right? But I would propose that while that is true, it is not truth itself. Truth itself is Krishna. Truth itself is a person. And therefore, when we speak about transcendental knowledge, we are speaking of knowledge about Krishna, right? So when we break down this chapter, I would say we can do texts 5 to 15. Texts 5 to 15 are all about Krishna, right? The transcendental knowledge of Krishna, right? So this whole time in the Bhagavad-Gītā, we've been talking about, the knowledge of the soul, social responsibility, what is the structure of society. We've been talking about these sort of things, how does the love of Godhead, we've been talking about people, right? We've been talking about souls. But finally, now we will begin to talk about Krishna, right? And so Krishna, he will begin to discuss himself. Of course, he will only do so when Arjuna poses the question, because Krishna isn't that narcissistic. So texts 5 to 15, they are all about the transcendental truth of Krishna. They are all about the transcendental knowledge of Krishna. Then texts 16 to 42, well, they are all about, I would say, they are about the means of attaining transcendental knowledge. So it's transcendental knowledge throughout, but the first half is about the knowledge of Krishna, And then the second half is about attaining that knowledge, right?
What was the second verse thing?
15 to 42. 16 to 42.
Thank you.
This is one way to break it down. This is the more common way. And of course, the opening texts 1 to 4, they're about the Parampara. They're about how this, we'll just say they're about the Parampara, right? The disciplic succession. That's one way to break it down. Another way to break it down, and we'll touch upon this later, is that the first section is about the activities of Krishna, and the second section is about the activities of the soul. This is maybe another way to break it down. This is a less common way. It's just how I read the text. You will also find that Krishna in the first half, he's describing how do I behave, how do I act? And then the second half, he's describing the actions and activities of the spirit souls. But the primary way that it's broken down is through this means of the theme of transcendental knowledge. Okay, so today we'll go as deep into that as we can. I was hoping we can touch on the nature of Krishna, right? The truth about Krishna, but I don't think we'll have time. And it's especially complex. It's probably the most philosophically complex we're going to have so far in the Bhagavad-Gita, because Krishna is a little harder to understand than one senses, right? So I'll probably save that for next week. We'll see how we go for time. But we'll begin now with text 1. And these texts here are some of the most famous texts in the Bhagavad-Gita. All of us will have heard some of them before, especially who doesn't know yada yada hi dharmasya, you know what I mean? Everyone's heard that once or twice, right? So texts like that, they're all coming up here. And while they're all very well and fun when we see them in the Mahabharata TV show, they're even much better when we see them in the flow of Krishna's point here, because Krishna, he's revealing some of the deepest truths about Godhead. We'll discover concepts like immutability, impassibility, ideas like this. What does it mean for a person who needs nothing to do, right? These are very profound questions, and Krishna, he dives into all of them in this section. It's not necessarily obvious, but when we dive into the commentaries, we'll find that this is exactly what Krishna is intending to discuss, right? They say, what can you give a man who has everything? We can say something much deeper about Krishna. What can we say? Why does the man who needs nothing do anything at all, right? So we'll find questions like this delved into and answered. But before we get to that, we also have to address another very central and important question. And that is that of the Parampara. How is transcendental knowledge received? How is it maintained? How is it preserved? And so we begin. Shri Bhagavan uvaca imam vivasvate yogam proktavan avyayam vivasvam manave praha manur ikshvakave bravit. Okay, maybe we can have Rani Mataji. Would you like to read out the English?
Yes. The personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna, said, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god, Vivasvan, and Vivasvan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed to Ishvaku.
Yes, Ishvaku. Okay, so we find here Krishna now, he's speaking about how he first established this transcendental knowledge of the Bhagavad-Gita. Okay, so we're finding here our first mention. I'm going to, actually no, we'll ask a question now quickly. Why do we think he's mentioning Vivasvan? He could mention anyone, right? And Krishna, he's spoken a lot of transcendental knowledge to a lot of people. Why is Vivasvan the one who is mentioned?
Because the first one to receive?
In one sense, he's the first one to receive, but on the other hand, the Bhagavad-Gita is eternal, right? It was never created, it was never destroyed. So yes, he is making a point, right? That the Bhagavad-Gita is very, very old, right? But Vivasvan is not the first to receive, because before him, Arjuna received it, right? When they were doing this pastime another time in another universe, right? And then before that Arjuna received it, another Vivasvan received it, right? So Bhagavad-Gita is eternal. Well, that's a very, very good guess, right? It's on the right lines.
Is it because Vivasvan, being the sun god, is of some significance to Kshatriyas because they worship the sun god?
Yes, very nice, very nice. That's 75% there, so we'll go with that, right? So firstly, again, when we say sun god, we're not referring to some polytheistic understanding. It's just another way of saying Deva, right? Is, if you will, it's if you'll check, it's a lowercase g god, right? It's not an uppercase g god. It's not polytheism. They're not these multiple gods or anything. Just the same as every other culture, the word God is more flexible in Sanskrit, right? You'll find the same thing in Greek. Often people are called theos, the Greek word for God, even though it doesn't literally mean God, right? Krishna is who we mean by God, right? Okay. So yes, Vivasvan. Firstly, what is the family? What is the lineage Arjuna comes in? Which Vamsha?
Kuru Vamsha, Prabhuji.
Yes, right? So he comes in Surya Vamsha, right? Which is associated with the sun. So firstly, Krishna, he's saying, will you come from the family lineage, which is associated with the sun, right? So therefore, this is relevant to you. But more so, and this is in the purport, Vivasvan, he is a Kshatriya, right? As are the descendants that are being described. He is a Kshatriya. And therefore, what is the responsibility of the Kshatriya? What is the responsibility of the ruler? Who can tell me? The purport discusses this. What do we think is the responsibility of a ruler in spiritual life? I mean, in spiritual societies. Yeah.
To maintain law and order.
Yes, to maintain law and order. And how do they do that? By educating their citizens, right? So very good. So they maintain this law and order by providing spiritual facility, right? Not like we can see these days, right? Where very much the opposite is promoted, right? By leadership, right? Instead, spiritual understanding is meant to be promoted, right? And so this is spoken to rulers. It is not that we say just the priests and the spiritualists should be spiritually mature, right? Back in the 2016 and 2020 elections in America, you'd often hear people saying, oh, I will vote for XYZ because I'm not voting for my priest, I'm voting for my president, right? This is not a Vedic mindset, right? Of course, we don't want our ruler to be a priest, but we definitely do want him to be somebody of spiritual quality, right? Of spiritual knowledge, because this spiritual knowledge is not impractical. It is a great guiding principle, right? Not only for how he rules, but also how he or she facilitates the education and understanding of the citizens. So it's very important. And for this reason, we find Vivasvan is mentioned. Now, another thing is Vivasvan, how long ago was he? Who can tell me? Who can find? Actually, I was contemplating whether we should do an activity or not. We will do an activity, even if we end up not covering as much as I wanted to, because I've talked too much to all of you. So our activity is, it's a short activity, only 5 minutes or so. I'll give you all 5 minutes. We'll split you up into groups. In the purport, there is a timeline that's given, right? There's all of these numbers that are meant to be crunched, okay? I'll give you 5 minutes. Please, in the groups you're in, I'll make only 3 groups because, again, as I said today, a lot of other stuff's been happening. So we have a shorter cohort, smaller cohort than regular. In your groups, I want you to draw together to draw up a timeline, okay? A timeline based on this data, right? If you need to Google, you can. I don't think you need to. I'm pretty sure enough information's there. You don't need to fill in the blanks. If you want to go above and beyond, you can. I won't stop you. But yeah, please go into your groups and then split out these numbers, because these numbers are significant to how the rest of the chapter goes, okay? Does that make sense? So just like the regular drawing activities, like the flowcharts and everything, draw it up and then show me and then send it into the WhatsApp group. Okay, does that make sense? Is anyone confused? Okay, how many people are here? 15 people, that's good. Create 3 breakout rooms. Okay, I'm gonna open all the rooms and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. As always, I'll check in to make sure you're done by then. Okay, Hare Krishna. Thank you. So we will continue then with the next text, okay? So this comes up because, by the way, remember how I say the Bhagavad-Gita is structured around Krishna's questions? We will hear in text 4. Krishna is going to say some really cool stuff, and all Arjuna is going to say is, the sun god Vivasvan is senior by birth to you. How am I to understand that in the beginning you instructed the science to him, right? So we'll come around to why, actually we'll do that now, because I think it ties well into that text. So we're going to jump around a tiny bit. So Arjuna, after Krishna says a few things, Arjuna asks this, right? We need to remember Arjuna's illusioned, right? Right now he's playing the role of an illusioned person. It's not actually that he's thinking, oh, wow, God's really old. I haven't heard that one before, right? It's not what Arjuna's doing. Arjuna's intentionally playing some illusion role, thinking, you're just how old was Krishna at the time of the Bhagavad-Gita? Who knows?
70 something years, I think.
125 is what I normally.
125, yeah.
Yeah. So 125, but I've never found a Shastric reference. So it could be 70 something, right? And actually, not to get complex, but some Shastras will say that great personalities, including the Supreme Personality, they age at like a quarter rate faster, a quarter rate slower. So if you crunch the numbers, it might turn out to something like that. Anyways, Krishna still looked like he was in the heart of his youth, even at 125. So Arjuna's thinking, even at 125, like, as we know from our timelines, that's nowhere near long enough to be speaking to Vivasvan, right? Definitely not before Manu was born. Remember, how many million years was it when Manu was born?
120 million 400,000 years ago.
Yeah. So 125 years isn't exactly in that ballpark. So Arjuna is using this moment, though, not that he's actually uncertain, right? He knows that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but he's saying this, again, because he's playing the illusion role, and also because he wants to give an opportunity for Krishna to talk about himself. I don't know about you, but for me, I've just been waiting. I want to talk about Krishna, right? I want to hear about Krishna's qualities. And Arjuna, he's feeling a similar thing, right? He's thinking, I want to hear about Krishna's qualities. I want to hear about what is the nature of Godhead, right? And so he asked this question to give Krishna an opportunity to speak. Because Krishna isn't just about to go out and say and talk all about himself, right? He's speaking about what's relevant to Arjuna, right? So we find this, Arjuna wants this. Not only, Arjuna also wants this to create an opportunity to refute those people who might say that Krishna is an ordinary person, right? And many people do try to say this, right? Oh, Krishna was he was a king or something. And I remember hearing one of those, one of those popular so-called so-called gurus, right, on Indian television. And he was saying something like that, right? And Krishna was blue because he was very special, something really weird like that, right? So when I was in India, I was flicking through TV and I found this guy talking and I was like, oh my God, what's going on? So, and he was saying that, right? He said Krishna was just some king, right? And so this is an idea that was obviously around still even at the time of Arjuna, right? Not everyone knew that Krishna was the Supreme Personality of Godhead, right? So again, this comes back. Often people will say, where's my archaeological evidence for Krishna? And there is some, right? We found a few coins here or there. There's one ancient coin that has a photo, like not a photo, an encarving of Krishna and Balaram on it. There's some archaeological evidence. Both sides will exaggerate how strong it is, right? Devotees sometimes will act like, you know, we have the full archaeological history of everything, and non-devotees will act like there's nothing, right? In reality, it's somewhere in the middle. Even if we did have all the archaeological evidence on earth, that wouldn't help at all, because even people who saw Krishna would not be able to recognize that he is the supreme personality of Godhead, right? So in order to refute the people even at the time who were thinking that, and people later on who might say, oh, well, in the Mahabharata, Krishna is just a normal person, and later on they decided to treat him like he's God. In order to refute this, Arjuna, he is asking this question. He's giving an opportunity for Krishna to explain his supremacy, and he's also giving Krishna an opportunity to describe himself, because the devotees just want to hear about Krishna. That is the desire of all of the devotees. So Arjuna, he's doing all of this. There's another aspect to this as well, to this question. And the other aspect is why did Krishna mention Vivasvan at all? So we mentioned earlier, right, about Kshatriya duties, about stuff like this, right? And all of that is relevant. However, there's also another aspect to it. And that is, again, this is very confusing, right? How could this person, who I think is my cousin, right? How could this person have spoken all of this knowledge so long ago? Krishna is intentionally creating a doubt, right? And this is showing two things. One, a concept I keep coming back to is that the Bhagavad-Gītā very much likes doubt. It is not a book of blind faith. It is a book of creating doubt and using the space that doubt creates in order to create faith, in order to create understanding, right? So Krishna, he's intentionally confusing Arjuna in order that he might doubt, because by doubting, he will come to understand more truly. And this comes to the second point. Doubt is the means by which true knowledge comes, because we are not having true knowledge right now. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in, right? We wouldn't be in, if anyone who needs the knowledge of the Shastras, right? Anyone who needs the knowledge of the Bhagavad-Gītā has an incorrect understanding of God, the world, themselves. And in order for true understanding to take the place of false understanding, doubt must be created. Doubt is not necessarily a destructive force, but sometimes, well, it is destructive, but sometimes you need to demolish an old building in order to build a new one, right? So Krishna, he has intention. So we shouldn't think that doubts are some negative, toxic thing, right? Doubt sometimes creates the space by which we can truly believe. So this is another reason why Krishna, he has said this. And so Arjuna, he has this doubt, right? And therefore he has expressed it. Now we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to talk about the Parampara a tiny bit before we wrap up today. And then next week, we will finally begin to discuss Krishna, the qualities of Krishna, and we'll have some very deep theology. At least I think it's pretty deep. It discusses debates that virtually every philosophical school have been having for forever, right? The simplicity of God versus his, anyways, we'll come to that later. So now let us go. Yes, very much so, right? So now we come to the Parampara, right? Which has already been discussed in text 1, but we're coming back to it. Evam parampara praptam imam raja shayo viduhu sakale neha mahata yogo nashta parantapa. I know for sure this is one of your memory shlokas, okay? So memorize it, please. Let us have let's have Shavina Mataji. Would you like to read out the English?
Yes, Prabhuji. The supreme science was thus received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings understood in that way. But in course of the time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it appears to be lost. Thank you.
Yes. No problem. So firstly, why is it saying, why does Srila Prabhupada write appears to be lost? Because what does he say in the first text? He says, this imperishable science, right? So if the science is perishable, if the science is imperishable, it's never going to be truly lost. And His Holiness Gaur Govinda Maharaj, he'll often make this point. He says, if at any point Krishna consciousness is not available on this earth, the earth actually would cease to exist. Because the whole purpose of this world is for us to learn the lesson that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and that He is very, very beautiful, and we should serve Him with love. That is the whole purpose of this material existence. If this knowledge was never available, then the world would have no purpose, and therefore the world would stop existing. But we know the world always exists, right? And so therefore it's always available somehow, right? So it appears to be lost. However, this specific disciplic succession has been broken, right? It has been broken. And now there's a lot of interesting things to be said. Firstly, I want to ask one thing. How has it been broken? Who can tell me? If we look at the text, what is it that has broken this succession? I'll give you some time. You can take a look. I'm very patient. I can wait for you all to find. What is it that has broken this knowledge? And Shri Mataji, you've raised your hand.
Is it something to do with how it says like the saintly kings understood it in that way? And so like the kings are no longer saintly, or like, I don't know, something like that.
That is a good point. And yes, that is the point, right? So the Parampara is broken by people misunderstanding it. However, that's not the ultimate cause. That's how it eventually gets broken, but that's not the ultimate cause. You're close. Also, just a side note, we might think saintly kings only applies to this Parampara. It applies to every Parampara. Every single disciplic succession is composed of saintly kings. We understand how they're saintly, right? How they're rishis, but also how they're kings. Our acharyas, they describe who was a king, but somebody who has conquered something, right? And all of the great personalities in the disciplic succession, they've all conquered their senses, and the senses rule the world. Therefore, they have all conquered the world, right? Simply by having it conquered their senses, they've conquered the world. And therefore, every parampara is actually composed of Raja Rishis, right? Not just this specific parampara. Okay. But so Shri, you're halfway there. Do you want to, if you just keep on going, what is the ultimate reason why the succession is broken? What causes it?
It is due to the interpretation according to personal whims.
Yes, so that is tying to what Shri mentioned, right? That's tied to what Shri Mataji mentioned, right? They understood it. Maybe they started understanding it in wrong ways, right? But okay, I'll say kalena, right? Kalena, by the course of time, right? Time itself has removed this parampara. This is interesting, right? Of course, how do we put it? The symptom is the unscrupulous people, right? And they present all sorts of nonsense ideas in the Bhagavad-Gītā. There's one famous edition of the Gita where when Krishna says, man mana bhava mad bhakto, when he says, become my devotee, right? They say, oh, he doesn't actually mean become a devotee of Krishna. He actually means become Krishna and stuff like that, right? So all of these ideas, right, will creep in, and we'll find so many weird ideas. I remember at my university, we had to, we were doing world religions. And so we looked at the Bhagavad-Gītā for the Hinduism unit, and we had to read the first chapter in all these different translations and commentaries. And some of the stuff that comes out there is wild, right? Absolutely wild, right? So there's all sorts of different ideas. People will co-opt it for all sorts of reasons. Not just the impersonalists, right? Who will really play around heavily with Krishna's words, but also in recent history, there was a big push to make the Bhagavad-Gita a patriotic nationalistic text. a lot of the editions from the 20th century came out like that, right? You know, Bhagavad-gītā is about, you know, they'll emphasize the yoga ladder, but they flip the yoga ladder around, right? They put karma yoga at the top and they put bhakti at the bottom, right? This is what really happened in the recent editions, right? So the original ones were the Mayavadis, but now it's the karma kandis, right? They're the ones who have really started pushing it. So I still remember I was reading one edition and he said, therefore, we should fight for political action. That's why I always pick on political action when we speak about twisting the Gita, because that's the recent innovation, right? So therefore we should do this and that. And it's like, no. The message of the Bhagavad-Gītā is therefore you should love the beautiful Krishna, not you should do anything else, right? Anything else is secondary. So yes, that is definitely there. And we can find so many bogus editions, right? Where people are pushing all sorts of agendas. But ultimately it is time, right? So Prabhupada, he's pointing out a very relevant way in which this parampara, right, can, the current one of the Bhagavad-Gītā, we can say is almost being watered down. But this original one, it faded away because of time. But who is time, right? Krishna himself, he says, Kalasmi lokachaya pravriddha, right? Is a dodgy NIV-esque Gita still the word of God? Yes, but in the same way that, just so everyone gets what Alex is saying, the NIV is a Bible translation and it's famous for being terrible. So we could say that would be an example, right? Yes, even Srila Prabhupada says this. Prabhupada says if the purports are there, then you can still understand the Gita properly. So long as one is reading it with a valid commentary, one can push past a bad translation. That being said, even if one is reading the Prabhupada's Bhagavad-Gītā as it is, and they are not doing so in the mood of service, if they're not doing so growing in their devotional service, then they haven't encountered it at all. The substantial aspect of whether one is genuinely encountering the Bhagavad-Gītā is if one is being transformed, if one is implementing that in their devotional service. That's when one truly has encountered the Son of God, if that makes sense. So it's very pragmatic, right? Yeah. So Krishna is time, right? So Krishna, he's in charge of the paramparas which come and go like that. And we'll discuss this a tiny bit, and then we'll continue the discussion next week about the parampara. I hope your brains aren't too fried, because this is probably some of the more important stuff we're studying. Chapter 4, I think, is the most important out of the first 6 in terms of relevance to us. So please, turn on the thinkers. If we can all flip all the way back to the beginnings of our Bhagavad-Gītas, all the way to past the introduction and right into the disciplic succession. Actually, for next week, if any of you can, I will send a PDF into the group or something. If you can print out the disciplic succession, because I'm going to annotate it next week. I'm going to run us all through the history of it a tiny bit. So I think it's an important history to know. And you'll need to annotate it as you go along, because it can be broken into chunks and everything. But we can find here, this is our parampara, right? It's very wholesome. This is our disciplic succession. And this one has been preserved, okay? Mrugank, don't worry about sharing it on the screen, because we won't comment upon it much. This is the one we find ourselves in. And in the same way now, Krishna, right? He is time. And by time, he allowed the other parampara to maybe fade away. But Krishna is also time, and he will not allow this parampara to fade away. This parampara is preserved, right? Because time is the ultimate cause which causes the paramparas to fade away. And we have a promise that this parampara will not fade away. In fact, we have a promise that 4 paramparas, 4 specific disciplic successions will not fade away. Does anyone know what those 4 are? They're mentioned in the Padma Purana. So it's not just something we've made up, right? It's mentioned in the Puranas. There are 4 which are promised, right? These ones will be preserved through Kali Yuga. Does anyone know? Each one is headed by a different individual, and they each have one significant teacher who's said to embody it. Oh, people are sending messages. Okay, yeah. Katyayani Mataji, were you going to say?
Yes, Prabhu, is it starting from Brahma, Shiva, Mother
Yes.
Lakshmi, and 4 Kumaras?
Perfect. All of them killed it. So we have one from Brahma. All are coming originally from Krishna, right? All are Krishna speaking to each one of these, right? So Brahma, Shiva, Lakshmi, and the 4 Kumaras. These are all 4 lines, right? And each one has a significant acharya, a significant teacher, a significant philosopher who's really solidified these lines. So in the line of Brahma, Mrugank has beaten us to it. It is Madhva, that's right. He's already started, it's right. It's Madhva, right? Madhva acharya, okay? In the line of Shiva, who knows who it is?
Rudra Sampradaya?
Yes, so the Rudra Sampradaya, but who is the acharya of the Rudra Sampradaya?
So Shankara by a chance?
No, it's not Shankara, but that's a really good guess, Alex. Yes.
Ashwini?
Sorry? No,
Ashwini?
no. Okay, this is maybe a little tricky questions. Okay, Shiva, in the Shiva Sampradaya is Vishnu Swami. But we don't hear much of Vishnu Swami because his Sampradaya, his Parampara is almost fully gone, right? The only people left in his line, so he's the only one who we're going to add a second person into, is Vallabha Acharya. So Vallabha Acharya, we might know Pushti Marg. Some of us might have met the Pushti Margis. They are coming in this line, right? So Vallabha Acharya, there's some debate about whether he fully represents Vishnu Swami's teachings or whether he sort of innovated in them. Either way, he is practically the main way that this parampara has continued into today's age. Now, in Lakshmi's line, who knows in Lakshmi's line? Maybe I can help if you think it's the Sri Sampradaya.
Ramanujacharya.
Ramanujacharya, our beloved Ramanujacharya. Okay, so Ramanujacharya, he has established this one. Or he is the teacher who has established this one. And then, we won't even, okay. And then the 4 Kumaras, who knows who this one is? Nimbarkacharya. Yeah, that's right, Mrugank. Yeah. Nimbarkacharya, also sometimes called Nimbaditya. Okay, this is a lot of information. You don't need to memorize this fully, but I think it's good to you should know that there's the 4 lines, right? But I'm just going into a lot of detail, so at the very least, you memorize a bit of detail. Now, each one of these acharyas, they have taught a different philosophy, right? Their philosophies are they're contradictory, but they're not fully contradictory, if you get what I mean. Our acharyas have said these are like different ways of perceiving one ultimate truth, right? These are different ways of explaining a very complex thing, right? I'm not going to go into all those 4 philosophies because I feel like all our brains are fried. This is so we'll save that for next week. But I will ask you all the question, which line do we all come in?
Brahma, Madhva, Gaudya
Sampradaya.
Yes. So our line, we come from Madhva Acharya. But we come, again, as has been said, we come in a sort of, what happened is the Madhva line, we can say it comes down in two lines, right? In the same way that Vallabha Acharya, he has sort of done his own little wing of the Rudra Sampradaya. Also, I hope this history lesson isn't too dry, but it's a fun topic, I find, at least. The Madhvacharya line split into 2 halves, but both halves have survived. On the one half, we have the Tattvavadis. The Tattvavadis are the main people who people will think of when they think of the followers of Madhvacharya. They love to do yagyas like that, right? That's their defining feature. They're really big into sacrifices because they say all of the sacrifices are bhakti, right? Because they're all about names of Krishna. And then the other line is the Gauriya line. And that is us. If we can say this is the you are here on a map, right? We are here on the map, the Gauriyas, right? The Gauriya Vaishnavas. And of course, Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he is the one who has created he is the one who has established this. although there is good historical arguments that this division already existed before Mahaprabhu. In the same way that Sri Vaishnavas existed before Ramanuja Acharya was preaching, right? It's not that he created them, he's just the great philosopher, right? In the same way, we can see there already was a division between the followers of Madhvacharya in the Bengal area and in other areas, right? But Mahaprabhu, he is the one who really explodes it, right? He's the one who causes it to blow up and explode. Now, I'm going to conclude on this point. I was hoping to speak about some philosophy of the Parampara, but we'll have to have that for next week. That's, yes, please leave, Divyansh Prabhu. And I don't mean please leave as in go away, but if you have to leave early, that's all right. Hare Krishna. So there's just 2 points that I want to make before we conclude today. Firstly, does everyone know why Mahaprabhu decided? Because Mahaprabhu could have joined any of these paramparas, right? Why did he choose to join the Brahma Parampara? Does anyone know? There's 2 reasons. Okay, firstly, and this maybe ties into our understanding of the philosophies, which we'll talk about next week. Madhva, he preached a philosophy called Dvaita Vedanta. He was the most aggressively against the Mayavadis, right? He's the one who most thoroughly, completely rejected any impersonalism. All of them reject impersonalism, but some of their philosophies are a little bit moderate, right? Whereas he was very intense in his rejection of Mayavad. And even though our philosophy, we could say, is very accommodating to some aspect of impersonalism, not impersonalism, but of Advaita, right? We have both, we have difference and non-difference. Still, Mahaprabhu appreciated this because Mahaprabhu is so strongly a devotee. He wants to feel that for love to exist, there must be some separation, right? And that love will eventually bind one closer than an actual unity would have, right? So because of that, Mahaprabhu is attracted to that. But also, because who is the first person that Krishna speaks Bhagavatam to? Who does Krishna speak Bhagavatam to? The Srimad Bhagavatam that we have received? Who has he spoken it to? Who can tell me?
Is it Uddhava Prabhu?
He's spoken it to Uddhav, but in the Srimad Bhagavatam we have today, who first hears the Bhagavatam? There's the seed Bhagavatam. There's 4 shlokas, right? Brahma, right? Brahma, he hears the Bhagavatam as the universe is created, right? So because of this, Brahma, he first hears the Srimad Bhagavatam, that great text, right? That text with which we base all of our spiritual life on, because it is Krishna in text form. And because of that, Mahaprabhu, he formally joins this line, because this is the line which Srimad Bhagavatam was born into and which is passed down in. But that is not to say that the other lines are unimportant to us. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he describes that Mahaprabhu, before he appeared, he actually appeared in visions to all of these different acharyas. And he explained how he will take certain bits of their philosophy as well. So even though we come in that line formally, in another sense, we are a merging of all of the lines. It is not that we are, even though we are coming in this parampara, we are also a merging of all of them. All of them have differences in philosophy, and we put our finger on the pulse and we say, yes, and all of your differences are because ultimately it is inconceivable. Because what is our philosophy? Achintya bheda bheda, right? We say you have all these differences because you are trying to conceive of the inconceivable. And therefore all of your philosophies are valid because they are trying to capture the inconceivable. But we say all of them, they are all trying, we just acknowledge, right? It is inconceivable. Who can understand it, right? And we can describe it, we can discuss it, we can philosophize about it, but it is ultimately inconceivable. And therefore, in that sense, we are a synthesis of all of the lines, right? And Mahaprabhu, he has taken parts from all of the lines. So again, he took initiation in the line of Brahma, but we are a merging of all of the lines, of all of the paramparas. In that way, Gauriya Vaishnavism, it is the final fruit of all of Vaishnavism. All of the Vaishnava lines, they fructify in the beautiful mango of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. like this, we find our line. There's a lot more to be said about that, but we will go over time. So I thank you all for attending today. I was hoping to get more into the Parampara, but it appears the time factor has also prevented us from doing that today as well. But yeah, so for next week, the homework is, I'm pretty sure I told you to read pretty far into the 4th chapter. So please just finish the 4th chapter. Just read the rest of the 4th chapter. That's the homework. Because I told you to read up to text 24, didn't I?
33, Prabhu.
33? Oh my, yeah, definitely. Just finish the 4th chapter then. Okay, finish the 4th chapter and please print out a Parampara, like the disciplic succession. I'll send a PDF of it. So print that out, please, so that you can annotate it because we're going to go into much more depth. Yeah, so that's the homework. So please finish that chapter and print out the PDF I'll send. Please turn up for next week. I mean, all of you have turned up this week, so I'm not throwing shade. But next week, especially, I think the Parampara topic is the most important topic to learn. So please turn up and fresh and ready. Next week is, and also the topics about Krishna's nature. I definitely think next week's lesson is going to be the most important one out of this module, in my opinion, in terms of philosophy, in terms of understanding. Our acharyas have actually said the rest of the Bhagavad-Gītā is established in these sections. So it's very important for us, this one. So yeah, all I'm saying is bring your thinking hats. Next week, we're going to go into really deep philosophy, but it's also going to be fruitful philosophy and very important. So yeah, so please finish the 4th chapter and print out a disciplic succession. We're going to talk about how the disciplic succession works, stuff like that, stuff that I think is pretty relevant. Are there any questions before we wrap up today?
Prabhu, I have a question.
For sure.
I'm not sure, I could be completely wrong. So from memory, I've heard this in classes that because you said these disciplic successions will not fade away in Kali Yuga, but I heard that our movement would fade away in the next 10,000 years or so because of the impact of Kali Yuga. Is that, but then this is contradictory to what you're saying that it will not fade away in Kali Yuga.
Yeah, so this is a very complex question, not because the answer is complicated, but because it seems like a simple question, but there's actually so many different directions you have to enter into this with. So firstly, the 10,000 year number is a very interesting number because it's never really mentioned anywhere in Shastra. Prabhupada, he mentions it. So I'm not saying it's a nonsense number. Prabhupada does talk about 10,000 years, but he speaks rather vaguely about it and he never gives any Shastra to explain what he's saying. So most of people's understandings of the 10,000 year number are relatively speculative. I'm not saying that is a speculation. I'm just saying it's all we can do because we have such little info about what Prabhupada's even referring to. Like he never really clearly explains what he means when he says 10,000 years. All those sort of predictions can be made, right? So some people argue all sorts of things, right? So when we talk about specifics regarding the 10,000 years, it's not a firmly established piece of our philosophy, is all I'm saying. There's that means the golden age lasts the rest of the Kali Yuga. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. We hear about things like the golden age and stuff like that, and it's not exactly clear. So we have different acharyas saying different things regarding that. Now to answer the question then, if we take a more pessimistic view, there's still Kalki, when Kalki comes, there will still be devotees with him, is my understanding, right? I don't think he is alone when Kalki comes, right? So there's still, even if we take a really pessimistic view, right, which Prabhupada at times seems to indicate, even if we take a really pessimistic view, still there's going to be some devotees there, right? So they will continue. On the other hand, we also have to remember that Kali Yuga, while it does influence us, while it does have all of these things, it is still a material thing. Kali Yuga, Satya Yuga, whatever Yuga, right? These are material time. Krishna consciousness transcends all material factors. So no matter how bad Kali Yuga gets, it never actually is a substantial obstacle to Krishna consciousness. Maybe the amount of devotees lowers because everyone is so degraded, but actually the Sankirtan movement of Mahaprabhu is for the degraded. So I don't think degradation ever really, that's the beautiful mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He gives the highest fruits, right? Pure love of Godhead, loving Krishna as a friend or as a lover, right? And he gives it to the lowest of people. This is how we know Mahaprabhu is the most graceful, right? He allows us to enter into the path which no other era ever could. And who does he give it to? He gives it to the most unqualified people. So there's a mercy of Mahaprabhu. So I don't really follow the logic sometimes that gets presented that Kali Yuga will mean that that no more devotees will be created, because at least in Mahaprabhu's movement, it is our speciality to turn Jagai and Madhais, the most fallen, into the greatest of personalities. So yeah, so there's that. We can't really say material factors will restrict Krishna consciousness, because Krishna consciousness transcends material factors, as we will discuss next week, right? Krishna, he transcends all of Varnashram and everything. And when the devotee is acting in Krishna consciousness, they're acting on the platform of Krishna's activities. So there's that, right? But even if you do take the pessimistic view, and even though I don't really hold to it too much, even if you do take that view, at the least you'd say our movement would struggle, right? Or the movement of Mahaprabhu would struggle, right? Maybe it's persecuted or something. You might want to take that perspective, but you can't say that there will be no devotees. There will always be devotees on earth. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Prabhu, for answering my question.
Yeah, and so we even have some acharyas like Gaur Govinda Maharaj. And again, this isn't a universal opinion, but he'll even say that this Kali Yuga will be a transformed one, and our Kali Yuga will actually become positive as the whole world becomes inundated in Krishna consciousness. But that is not a universal opinion, and that's a minority opinion, is my understanding. So please don't take that understanding as and think that that's my understanding. Is that's a minority understanding, but I like it. I think it's an attractive idea, right? That the whole world gets flooded by kirtan. But again, that is a minority view. Again, our acharyas can disagree with each other, which is another thing we will be discussing next week. The acharyas do disagree with each other on many things, and that's not the end of the world. Okay, Vidhi Mataji, there's a question.
Yes, Prabhu, I have a question, but before my question, just wanted to compliment what you said. Actually, it is mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam, 12th canto, that when Kalki Maharaj will come, and once he leaves, he will leave behind his disciples who will carry on and bring the Satyog. So you're right. It's never going to be that there won't be devotees on this earth. It's just that demonism will increase so much that devotees will get clouded by that. That's all. Yeah. Prabhu, my question is a little out of context. I just wanted to know, Manu appears once in Brahma's day or night. What is that equation?
So, Mataji, off the top of my head, I can't tell you. Like timeline questions are the end of my life. Anytime there's numbers coming up, like I can't help you. I'll send a chart. I'll send a chart.
That's Mrugank, that one day is Kalpa is one day of Brahma, but Manu appears once in the day of Brahma or once in every 50. I don't know. I can't recollect that.
I need to get back to you on Manvantara periods. Like, I'm sorry, it's just off the top of my head, like I was telling one of the groups, cosmology and timeline stuff. Cosmology stuff, I forget it. If I haven't studied it yesterday, it just falls out of my head.
It is complicated, yeah. All right,
No so I'm sorry, I'll get back to you next week on that. If you send the question into a WhatsApp group, because I know I have it in my notes, I just, in my mind is not made for numbers. So
thank you so much.
No problem. And Katyayani Mataji, I think you had a question?
No, Prabhu, sorry, accidentally read. Sorry for that. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, are there any other questions? Well, if not, sorry?
Alex has one more comment. Kalki equals Messiah.
Oh yeah. So Kalki is a Shakti Avesh avatar, and we'll discuss what that sort of avatar is next week as well. I'm telling you, I'm hyping up next week. Next week's going to be a lot of important stuff. We'll cover that as well. Who will come to end Kali Yuga, and he'll inaugurate Satya Yuga. And coming to the idea, so the people who hold the view that Krishna consciousness will spread and cover the whole world, so they say that this Kali Yuga is actually the Prema Yuga, and when Kalki comes, he'll be singing in the kirtan, instead of slaying. But that, again, this is a minority view. The majority view is that the world will be absolutely horrendous, and Kalki will come and he will, it's very similar to like the descriptions of Jesus in the book of Revelation. He'll come on a horse and he'll slay all of the evildoers and he'll inaugurate the Satya Yuga again. But yes, he's the next avatar that we're waiting for. Another few 100,000 years though before he comes. Okay. Any other questions? Well, I'll just wrap up. I have said the two views, but I do want to say what my view is, just so I'm clear on my. I personally think both views. I take a middle view between both views. I think Kali Yuga is happening as normal. I don't think it's a guarantee that Krishna consciousness will spread over the earth, but I also think it's a possibility that it can. So I think either result is possible, because again, I don't think there's strong shastric evidence that Krishna consciousness is guaranteed, that the kirtan, that the whole world will be engaged in kirtan, but I do think it's possible. So if with the mercy of the devotees, it's possible that the whole world becomes covered in kirtan, and therefore the world won't go terribly, right? But it's also a possibility that it doesn't happen. So my view is sort of in the middle of those views, because based on the idea that Krishna consciousness is transcendental to time, place, and circumstance. Okay, I just wanted to share my view so you understand where my personal biases might be. Okay, that's that. We'll call it a day there. Thank you all for turning up. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Thank you, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.